I wanted to talk about the bad teams in the NBA and our personal experiences playing on bad teams. So right now, there are 4 teams with a net rating over -10. And I think in NBA history, there's only been a couple of times where there's been 2 teams. And right now, the Spurs, the Pistons, the Hornets, and the Wizards, all with a -10 or higher plus-minus net rating. These teams are objectively bad. They're bad teams. Spurs with 5 wins, Pistons with 3 wins. Look, I don't know that either team sets the all-time record for most losses, but you played on a team in 1993, 1994, the Dallas Mavericks, that went 13-69. Real quick, you guys started 1-3, then you went on a 20-game losing streak to go 1-23. You won a game, then you had a 16-game losing streak. You were 2-39 at the halfway point. You were 8-46, and then you had a 17-game losing streak. Now, you won your 9th game. There's 10 games to go. You've tied the all-time record. I want to know what those last 10 games were like. What was the dialogue in the locker room as you guys had these incredibly long losing streaks and truthfully were in danger of setting the all-time record?
Well, all right. So this is interesting going back to this time in my life, because it was like, I did 3 years laying on a psychiatrist's couch to forget about all this. Money well spent, by the way, to get rid of the PTSD from it. But so it's interesting when you're on a team that bad, and we were the youngest team in the league. And so we had some young guys that were still trying to get their feet wet in the NBA. We did have some lottery picks on that team, though. And we had one veteran player that everybody looked up to, in Derek Harper, who was our starting point guard. And by that time, of course, he played on a team that went to the Western Conference Finals. And now here he is a few years later, and this is the worst team in the NBA. He eventually gets moved out. But as the year's going on, JJ, you start off, obviously, you're losing a ton of games early. You mentioned the way you put it, you went on a 20-game losing streak. I think that's funny. Usually you say went on a winning streak. We endured a 20-game losing streak early in the year. So at that point, you kind of know your season's cooked, and you're really just playing for like personal pride and to try to establish yourself, and the organization's making whatever decisions they are. But here's the thing. You're still kind of showing up every night. It's a little bit lighthearted. You're not very good. And you're just going out there playing loosey-goosey because you got nothing to lose, until, JJ, you start getting into that territory where you're talking about record-setting ineptitude. Okay, when that starts becoming a topic of conversation with the media and national storylines, you're putting on SportsCenter, they're talking about this every time you lose a game, then it starts to feel a little bit like kind of like panic mode is setting in, because you have a feeling. I mean, you might be on a roster that ends up winning less games than any team in the history of the league. So if you look at that, 8-63 with 11 games to play, we are 1 game short of tying the all-time ineptitude. And then, of course, we win 2 games, we're out of that conversation. And we win, I think 5-6 in our last 11 games. So we got hot late.
I love that 5 and 6 is being hot.
yeah, 5 and 6, red hot, to avoid infamy. And I do remember the weight once it started to get into that territory, that second long losing streak that we had. That's when you started really worrying and getting concerned that you were going to be part of this team. And it's hard if you're associated with something like that, man. It's going to come up every now and then, and you're going to be associated with that. Your name's on that roster. So I just remember this sense of relief, incredible amount of relief, when we got that 10th win. And we didn't have to worry about it. And then we actually won the last 2 games of the year, as I guess everybody was kind of getting ready for the summer. We played extremely loose and free, and we won the last 2 games to get to 13.
There's an interesting dynamic here when you play on a bad team. And I want to get to the competitive aspect of it, the weight of winning and losing in a second. But one of the things that happens, and you touched on this a little bit, is you want to play for the team. You want your team to win. And there's some reality of our team sucks. And then so you have to balance that with your own personal ambitions. And I think to a degree and I'm not saying this is happening in Detroit or San Antonio or any of these places. I'm just speaking of my own personal experience, and I want to get your perspective specifically with that team, where that sort of balance gets out of whack and there's a schism in the locker room and people start playing for themselves. Like, did you feel that? Did you experience that at all on that Mavs team?
Oh, absolutely. Without question. We experienced that. It was brutal. And it's so hard when, you're a player like I was. I always considered myself a guy that, I was always, I worked hard. I was prepared. I had fought at that point to kind of establish myself after being in Europe and being in the CBA. And now the year before that, I joined the Mavs, and now this is year 2. And so I'm still trying to establish what I think I am as an NBA player. But you're used to being a good teammate, playing the right way and making pretty obvious decisions on the court of how you're supposed to play. And that kind of goes out the window. Even practices become chaotic at that point. And it doesn't feel like professional. It feels like you're very much out there for yourself. And look, if you don't adopt some of that mentality as a player yourself, no matter how you've been taught or what you believe in, and all of the things that are your core principles as an athlete, as a player, as a human being, if you can ascribe to all of those things, but if you don't at some point have some of that in you where you're playing for yourself as well, you are going to get swallowed up in the situation. And you're going to be not only on a bad team, you're also going to be a guy that's irrelevant on a bad team because you're not noticed, because you're the one guy that's trying to do things the right way. So there's no question that seeps in. And as the deeper you go into the year, the more it does. And as you get closer toward the end of the season, and when you're like 6 weeks out, and now, so here we are, like early March, and we're still in this period where we don't know if we're going to end up with the worst record in history. And guys are already starting to think about getting to the off season. Some cases, guys know they're not going to be there anymore, whatever. You talk about a relaxed atmosphere, and it just becomes a situation that's really tough, man. You've got to have a little bit of selfishness in you in that situation to continue to go out, because you're not just playing at that point for the Dallas Mavericks. You're playing for the entire league every single time you go on the court, because there's a good chance this entire thing's about to be blown up. And you want to prove to some people what you're capable of doing as a player. So it does go against what you believe in. If you've been raised a certain way and taught and coached a certain way, you have to get away from that a little bit and have a little bit of narcissism in what you're doing in order to survive it and to continue to have a career beyond that season.
We touched on the Pistons earlier this year when they were going through that losing streak, and we brought up the word, I think I said it, you lose a sense of purpose. Because I think the purpose of an NBA basketball season is winning and losing for sure, and then it's also growth. And so you sort of, I found it when I played on the Orlando team the first year after we had fired Stan. We trade away Dwight. We've got a youth movement, but we've still got some vets hanging around from those sort of glory years. I know we didn't win, but those were glory years for the Orlando Magic, and in that run with Stan. We've got me, we've got Turk, we've got Jameer. We brought in Aaron Aflalo. Glenn Davis was on the team as well. So like there was this, we knew the youth movement was coming. We knew they were trying to rebuild through the draft. And there was a real sense, I think, from the vets of like frustration, because we were used to things going a certain way. And I remember, we started that season 12-13. We win a home game against Washington, but Baby gets hurt. And we went on a 10-game losing streak. We win a game in LA, a day game versus the Clippers, that Lob City team before I got there. Then a few games later, we start another losing streak. We lose 12 in a row, win a home game against Portland. I was traded shortly thereafter. I remember thinking at some point during that first losing streak, because you start 12-13 and you're like, we were supposed to be a lottery team. Maybe there's a chance we can sneak in the playoffs. Management's probably not going to be excited about that, but maybe there's a chance. And then sort of reality sinks in, and you almost have to reframe your purpose. And for me, it wasn't about like stats on that team. It was the first year where I felt like I got to play like how I want to play. Jacques Vaughn came to me. He's like, I'm going to run plays for you. All right. You might start some games. You might be, he referenced Manu Ginobili. You might be our Manu sometimes coming off the bench, but the offense is going to run through you. I had the career high in assists that year. So I got to play the way I wanted. So it wasn't for me on that team. It wasn't like, oh, I've got to go out of my way to put up stats, because when I was on the court, like, I was very involved in the offense. I reframed the winning and losing part as the growth of me as a player, but more importantly, that year specifically, it was like, how do I become a better leader? And look, there was a couple weeks there where we were losing games and I was not happy. I was ornery day to day. And it was one of the few times in my career where I can say I wasn't the same guy every day, right? So I sort of had to reframe my brain. I had to reframe the purpose. All right, I'm going to really lean into being a leader. I'm going to be a leader for Andrew Nicholson, for Nick Vucevic, for Etuan Moore, for Mo Harkless. Like, that's what I'm going to, Kyle O'Quinn was on that team too. I'm going to lean into that. And it gave me a sense of purpose. I think something else you said that really sticks out to me is the feeling of irrelevance. That was really the first time in my career where I felt that irrelevance. And I remember specifically Monday of free agency. It's the second day of free agency. I had a sushi dinner in LA with Doc Rivers and my agent and Greg Lawrence. Aaron Tellem was there. And the thing I said to Doc, I was like, you have to make this sign and trade happen. I don't want to be irrelevant. I want to play on a relevant basketball team. And the other teams I was deciding to potentially sign with, I didn't get the sense that they were going to be relevant teams. I didn't get the sense that they were going to be true contenders. And that feeling of irrelevance to me was the big, like, not being a part of a team that mattered. That is a different experience. You're on the Boston Celtics. You're on the LA Lakers. You're on the Pistons or the Hornets. Those are two different NBA experiences.
No, it's so true. One of the things I can relate to, and you talk about becoming a better leader. So let me just tell you a couple of things about that season, 93-94. First, we have Derek Harper on the team as our only real veteran, proven player at that point. Jimmy Jackson, we had drafted the year before as a lottery pick, and this was a different time when, before you had the rookie scale slotted in. So he held out for most of the season. He didn't join the team the previous year till March. So Jimmy Jackson comes in, plays like the last 6 weeks of the season, plays great. The city thinks that, okay, maybe we have, a franchise type player, a lottery pick. The following year, the 93-94 season that we're talking about, we draft Jamal Mashburn. So now Mash comes in as a high lottery pick, and he clearly was a transcendent offensive talent. You could see that immediately. And we have Derek Harper on the team. There's a little bit of hope at the start of the year, but then the losing starts kicking in right away. And Derek Harper at that point, been around a while, been on good teams, was like, look, and he and Quinn Buckner, who had just been hired to coach that year, they kind of butted heads. And so Derek Harper wants out. We trade him to the Knicks. He goes to the Knicks, and I think the year after they go to the NBA Finals as their starting point guard for Derek Harper. I was so happy for him because he's one of my favorite teammates of all time. And so Harper leaves, and now it's really just a bunch of young guys all in this chaotic situation. A lot of selfishness, I felt like, kicked in. But talk about leadership moment. So we're at practice one day, and the coaching staff is so disgusted with how things are going at practice, I guess the lack of seriousness, they basically leave. Say, you know what, you guys go coach yourselves. We're out. They walk out of the gym, the entire staff. And we're all looking around at each other, and you know what? And the players are like ready to go, like leave. And I'm like losing my mind, like, no, we're gonna stay here. We're gonna get something done, man. Are you kidding me? You guys, this is embarrassing. Let's play, let's work. We ended up just playing like basically some really intense pickup basketball, but it felt like it was like the first time that I experienced in a while. Guys wanted to win. Like it was pickup ball, but that mentality kicked in, and every player who's ever played and got to that level, you know what it feels like to play pickup game. You lose, you got five guys waiting, you're not in the next game. Like you want to hold court, and that's what it felt like that day. But it was like, I remember I was the one that got very vocal about it. Like, we're not walking out of the gym because the coaches left. We're going to get something done here, because I was so sick of losing and sick of the embarrassment and sick of like just the environment that we were in on a daily basis, even with our home crowds. It was crazy. And all the different side stories that happen throughout the year, that just things get very bizarre and weird. And you're just trying to survive, JJ, at that point. You're trying to survive, and something better is coming for you. And the one good thing about that year for me was I think people got to see that I could shoot the ball at the level I needed to at the NBA level. I could do that. I could compete at that level athletically. I could do all those things because I think I had some doubters going into that. Probably the year before I really started to prove it, but then that year getting an entire season. So, and I think a lot of guys in that locker room that were playing for themselves kind of felt that way. If they proved something or they didn't, it was really about yourself in a bubble. That's what it felt like the second half of the year. And it's a terrible feeling in a team sport because the best feeling in the world as a basketball player is when all guys are connected and you're playing for the same thing and it's us against the world and everybody in this locker room, like all that matters, like that mentality, very hard to hold on to that when you're losing night after night.
My first year in New Orleans, we started 6-9, and then we had a 13-game losing streak. And during that losing streak, I saw some of the things you're talking about start popping up, right? Body language, individualism, some selfishness. So I go to Alvin Gentry before practice. I'm like, I don't know how long this is going to take, but we're going to meet as a team, just the players. And I don't know your experience with players-only meetings. Sometimes they're productive, sometimes they're not. I can say that was probably the most productive player meeting that I was ever a part of. Drew and I, we sort of led it, but we opened the forum and everybody got to talk. And the end of that season, we end up Zion comes back in January. We end up playing really well all the way up until COVID hits. We're in a position to compete for a playoff spot. We didn't play particularly well in the bubble. But in my exit interview with Alvin Gentry and Chris Finch, this is one of the greatest things a coach has ever said to me. They said, our locker room could easily have been lost. The fact that this season actually turned out to be an enjoyable one with the group is a real testament to you and Drew. And that moment, like, it meant a lot to me. And I don't think I would have been prepared for that moment if it wasn't for that last year in Orlando where I sort of embraced the leadership aspect.